Opposing Viewpoints, Book 2, White Collar Crime, Book 2, How Does Money Laundering Occur and What Can Stop It? Viewpoint 2, Banks Can Be Penalized for Not Stopping Money Laundering by Brian Monroe, starting with a quote, "These include unusual transactions out of scope with the business, nebulous origin of funds, politically exposed persons, cash, and more." This viewpoint examines some of the ways that banks are expected to monitor financial transactions for potential involvement in money laundering, namely by highlighting a major Dutch bank that was punished for not doing that. The bank, ABN AMRO, is one of the largest in the country's financial system, and the viewpoint eliminates what kind of transactions should have been a major red flag for the bank. Brian Monroe is a writer for a blog run by the Association of Certified Financial Crime Specialists, a trade group based in Georgia. As you read, consider the following questions. Number 1, according to this viewpoint, why is individual liability considered one of the most feared arenas of compliance enforcement? Because of jail time. 2, what are and penalties, civil money penalties? What are some reasons that banks have trouble complying with anti-money laundering programs? 3, what is the role of banks in either combating or facilitating money laundering? Dutch authorities have hit the third largest bank in the Netherlands with a penalty of more than $500 million for long-standing failings in nearly every area of its fin crime compliance program, including lax customer risk scoring, shoddy alert investigations, and missed reports of potential suspicious activity. The Netherlands Public Prosecution Service, NPPS, has settled its probe into Amsterdam-based ABN AMRO Bank for 480 million euros, or just less than $583 million, for falling seriously short of any money laundering compliance program requirements and being considered culpable in aiding criminal groups in cleansing ill-gotten gains. The settlement, however, while lifting one specter of uncertainty for a banking group more than 300 years old, still has lingering tethers of risk in one of the most feared arenas of compliance enforcement, individual liability. The NPPS stated that the investigation into the individuals responsible is ongoing, but the agency has already identified 3 former members of the bank's board of directors as being effectively responsible for the AML violations, a detail that should not be lost on top compliance executives, the C-suite, and the typically aloof, insulated, and protected board members. Depending on the final tally of evidence gathered, these directors and others could be criminally prosecuted for money laundering. In recent years, the Netherlands, along with other Nordic and Baltic regulators, investigators, and watchdog bodies, has become a stronghold of compliance enforcement in Europe, levying historic U.S.-style penalties against banks in the country. With the 2018 AML action against ING Group approaching the 1 billion mark, investigators stated that between roughly 2014 and 2020, and even during a massive retooling, restructuring, and staffing ramp up of AML in 2019, ABN AMRO fell seriously short of the country's AML rules. Those prolonged and pervasive failings throughout foundational areas of AML, including customer due diligence and risk scoring, to the more advanced, arcane, and subjective environments of alert investigations and dispositions and filings of reports on suspicious activity, gave carte blanche to clients engaging in criminal activities for a long time. AML breaches at ABN AMRO both serious and structural. Investigators detailed a bevy of weaknesses and serious shortcomings in the areas of ABN AMRO's AML program, including lack of due diligence, data, documents with regard to each of the 4 business lines. It was, for example, determined that client data or documents were missing, or that the source of data in client files was unclear. 2, tanking the risk ranking. ABN AMRO did not properly conduct client due diligence and the related risk assessment and finalized risk classifications that led to the bank assigning risk classifications to a considerable part of its clients in an incorrect manner. And third, automations running amok. Due to the faulty automated analysis of identity data, some 5.5 million mass retail clients were in fact classified in the lowest risk category, 0 neutral, without adequate risk analysis, a structural failing due to a lack of due diligence depth. These gaps also bled into risk scoring tied to cash transaction expectations. Fourth, transaction monitoring, alert investigation, disposition. Investigators found further weaknesses tied to ABN AMRO's transaction monitoring, including adverse events and changes feeding the bank into the original risk ranking, and thus returning the transaction monitoring protocols more tightly to those now higher risk entities. Fifth, poor ratio of alerts to investigators. The transaction monitoring system structurally generated more alerts than the staff were able to handle. As a result, for several years, ABN AMRO struggled with a backlog in handling alerts. There were several instances of late reporting the country's Financial Intelligence Unit, FIU. Lastly, when the exit becomes a revolving door, there were shortcomings in ABN AMRO's exit process, as a result of which it could happen that the bank did not terminate relationships with clients with an unacceptable risk classification, or that clients that had been exited were nonetheless able to become clients once again. What does culpable money laundering mean? Beyond broad system-wide failings in AML prongs, programs, and processes, investigators also highlighted several specific examples that constituted the foundation of the accusation of culpable money laundering. In short, these include unusual transactions out of scope with the business, nebulous origin of funds, politically exposed persons, cash, and more. Overall, Dutch investigators highlighted dozens of instances where they believe the bank should have picked up on the aberrant activities and reported them to authorities, leading to illicit entities abusing accounts for their own purposes. The failings included a panoply of suspected crimes, from tax finagling to corruption, laundering, and fraud. Here are some of the examples. The low-risk tax fracas. A low-risk tax fracas. That's the first example. Gambling with the devil is the second, and negative news corrupts completely is the third. So let's read these three. A low-risk tax fracas. One client of ABN AMRO, who had been allocating the lowest risk classification, had opened a total of 192 bank accounts with ABN AMRO for 49 of their companies between 2014 and 2018. These accounts were mostly inactive. This client committed fiscal fraud, receiving almost 200,000 euros from the tax authorities on its business accounts. Following transfers to their private accounts with ABN AMRO, most of this money was spent or withdrawn in cash by the client. Despite the various signals and doubts that existed within ABN AMRO regarding this client, the risk classification remained low. The bank did not report unusual transactions to the FIU until the start of the criminal investigation into the client. Gambling with the devil. This is the second example. Another client of ABN AMRO, also with a low-risk classification, was employed in the financial department of a wholesaler. The client had a gambling addiction, had debts, and his account was consistently overdrawn. ABN AMRO was aware of these problems. The client adjusted the details of the funds of his employer's debtors, which resulted in those funds being transferred to his own bank account at ABN AMRO. Over a 9-month period, the amount in excess of 4.3 million euros was transferred to the personal bank account of the client. That money was then almost entirely spent gambling away. ABN AMRO hardly performed client due diligence on this client. The client file turned out to be incomplete, and the deviations from the usual transaction pattern did not generate any alerts in the transaction monitoring system. Negative news corrupts completely. Another example relates to 2 Dutch companies that held bank accounts with ABN AMRO in the period 2010 through to 2017. Payments passed via the accounts of these 2 companies totaling several tens of millions. A corruption case in which companies were supposedly involved was widely covered in national and international media since 2015. Nonetheless, it took ABN AMRO until March of 2019 to first report to the FIU. It was also found that there were shortcomings in the client due diligence regarding these two companies. And before moving on, there's a study. Is it a charity or a money laundering scheme? Criminals may seek to launder their money through the charity and then receive it clean at the other end. For example, a criminal may make a donation in cash or via online banking, either directly or through an intermediary, in order to place their money into the legitimate financial system and layer it to conceal its illicit source. Donations subject to unusual conditions, for example. Who is this person? Okay, continuing. For example, a criminal may make a donation in cash or via online banking, either directly or through an intermediary, in order to place their money into the legitimate financial system and layer it to conceal the illicit source. Donation subject to unusual conditions, example, a particular individual or organization being engaged to carry out work, unsolicited offers or loans to charities, or a sudden request to return all or part of a donation might be intended to facilitate money laundering. Alternatively, they may set up a beneficiary that appears legitimate but is in fact a front for their criminal activities in order to receive the money once it has been laundered through the charity's bank account. Tricks such as converting the money into a different currency, exchanging money for goods and back again, moving the money through multiple bank accounts across 2 or more jurisdictions, and using the intermediary such as an NGO or a State Department are used to further obfuscate the origin of the funds. Criminals may also seek to obtain tax and other financial benefits from making a charitable donation. For example, a criminal who pays the UK tax on their legitimate activities may seek to take advantage of that fact that those who pay above the basic rate of tax can claim back the difference between the rate they pay and the basic rate of their charitable donation. Having made a charitable donation, the criminal would be able to claim that money back, and it would then be ostensibly from a legitimate source. Criminals may donate money to the charity in exchange for some other non-pecuniary benefit, which is, for example, a professional affiliation that will give their criminal enterprise a veneer of respectability and legitimacy. This quotes The Risks and Penalties of Money Laundering for Charities and How to Guard Against It by Nicola Finnery, Kinsey, Napoli, March 4th of 2021. So, the last subsection of this chapter states, rating agencies not rattled on bank after penalty. While penalties, remediation, and reputational costs for AML failings can feel costly, ratings agencies didn't pillory ABN AMRO, but instead pulled out bright spots seemingly hidden among all of the bad news. For example, even though the identified deficiencies are serious, they largely relate to the period before 2019 launch of the bank's Detecting Financial Crime Comprehensive Plan, according to Fitch Ratings. As part of the mandated remediation and company-wide AML upgrades, ABN AMRO strengthened its IT infrastructure, centralized AML relating controls, and hired a large number of full-time employees, expected to surge to 4,200 this year, double of what it was just a year ago, at a cost of more than $500 million. With the settlement now finalized, the sentiment from industry and outside reviewers is that Dutch authorities have assessed the bank's program, expecting to be fully operational and finalized next year, to be sufficient to restore compliance with the law. As well, on the plus side, the investigation did not find evidence that the bank was systemically involved in suspicious transactions or pursued high-risk customers, according to analysts. In all, Fitch notes that the penalty will cause a small loss in the first quarter of 2021, but don't fret, the seemingly hefty statement-making settlement will be comfortably absorbed by the bank's annual operating profit, which we expect to recover to about Euro 1 billion in 2021 from close to break-even in 2020. Only time will tell if the bank is able to execute on its promises of improvement to craft a culture of compliance that can, as the regulators want, put all the various pieces together. but at the very least, the institution is working on another aspect of compliance, much ballyhooed in the United States and internationally, a tone from the top. As a bank, we do not merely have a legal but also a moral duty to do our utmost to protect the financial system against abuse by criminals. ABN AMRO CEO Robert Swack said, "In fulfilling this duty, we aim to make a meaningful contribution to the safer society," he said. "Regretfully, I have to acknowledge that in the past, we have been insufficiently successful in properly fulfilling our important role as gatekeeper. This is unacceptable, and we take full responsibility for this." So I would have downplayed it a little bit too, because at least the 3 examples that they gave are not strong. So, number 1, they've got a bunch of inactive accounts that are withdrawing cash for, one client's various 49 different companies. So, if they did enhanced due diligence, maybe they would find that 49 companies is too much for the type of client that they have, and there's a large portion of inactive accounts, which is unusual for the type of business. So yeah, they could do EDD there, and maybe they could find that, and that is all dependent on facts. But as far as gambling with the devil, if a guy is constantly overdrawn and then he has an immediate turnaround in his life and is bringing in $4.3 million over the course of a 9-month period, his profile of going from overdraft to being rich is perhaps one alert, but it's not going to alert you every single time he gets paid if now his new profile is that he's getting large electronic deposits. So I don't even think they did something wrong here. It's not the bank's responsibility to be law enforcement and identify all forms of fraud. This type of siphoning is traceable and can be prosecuted by the party that's been harmed. So, and then the negative news. So, sure, they could have identified and blocked that party's account, but when they say negative news, they're not saying specifically designated national, which you must block. So it's not technically a violation of any money laundering laws. So that's where I think it is tongue-in-cheek that they're saying that they fully appreciate how wrong this behavior is. Because if those are the only 3 things that were being done wrong, then yeah, the penalty is excessive. But when you look at the structural problems that they were talking about, it gives me the idea that more than just these 3 examples were occurring, and they're probably just giving us the lightest of a bunch of other findings that are probably a bit too graphic to share. So, that's my opinion and viewpoint 2 in how does money laundering occur and what can stop it.